we have been doing today, I will disclose that I have worked with both Professor Boersma and Professor Wright in my time as an academic. Thank you for appearing. Could each of you please state your name, title, and swear either an oath or an affirmation, starting with you, Professor Boersma?
Sure. So my name is Martijn Boersma. I'm an associate professor at the University of Sydney Business School, and I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Professor Wright.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Chris Wright. I'm also an associate professor at the University of Sydney, the Business School, and I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. And would you like to start by making a short statement?
Yes, I'll make one on both our behalf. So good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to present evidence today, both on behalf of myself and my colleague Chris. Government procurement represents a substantial portion of the economy and provides a unique opportunity to drive significant social and economic benefits. The power of procurement, public procurement, can indeed and should be harnessed to promote decent work, local employment, and sustainable development. In line with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the Sustainable Development Goals, it's crucial for government procurement practices to integrate social considerations. In New South Wales, we have made commendable strides towards transparency and accountability, which is exemplified by the New South Wales Modern Slavery Act. However, there's still more room to leverage public expenditure more effectively to foster local job creation and regional economic growth. Our submission makes several key recommendations. We argue for establishing a centralized procurement oversight. We argue in favor of lowering the threshold for contract disclosure as well, prioritizing local suppliers, integrating social procurement clauses, and potential supplier debarment as well. I won't go into too much detail because you've probably read the submission. Our recommendations are designed to ensure that procurement practices not only deliver value for money, but also promote social and economic development. By prioritizing local content, enhancing transparency, and embedding social considerations into procurement processes, we can create a more equitable and sustainable future for New South Wales. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I could begin maybe with your first recommendation. It has been a sort of recurring theme in our hearings and evidence about the various benefits or otherwise of centralised and decentralised systems. You're talking about a centralised procurement oversight. Some would probably argue that this already exists in the framework, that there is a procurement board. Indeed, I think Mr. Tudor has with him the procurement frame, the policy framework, that there is this centralised system already. So why do you think this hasn't been adequate, and what might need to change?
Yeah. I did read the report from June of this year, and obviously there are a lot of, I suppose, dimensions there which highlight the current shortcomings of the New South Wales Procurement Board, which I suppose can be summarised in terms of lack of effective oversight, transparency issues, data collection issues, ineffective self-attestation, which is another issue. I think broadly it's about striking a balance between the devolution of procurement and centralisation. Ultimately, a part of that has to do with the, I suppose, lack of expertise of procurement officers as well, which is something that I got from the report. And finally as well, I think which is a suggestion made in your report as well, is the need for improved feedback mechanisms for, I suppose, failed tender processes as well. So there's a range of items there which I think, without, I suppose, wanting to, criticize too much work that they've been doing, that there is, I suppose, euphemistically room for improvement, if you will. And those 10 items that are mentioned in the report, I think, highlight that very well.
I mean, a related issue that, again, we have been canvassing a bit is, and I think that the last witness mentioned that a policy which is just words on a paper doesn't really mean much in reality. Do you think enforcement is an issue? Do you have any thoughts on enforcement? And this might be for both of you. I know Professor Wright also has worked in this area.
Yeah, well, definitely. And I think I mentioned, for example, the New South Wales Modern Slavery Act before, which again is very commendable, but at the same time suffers enforcement issues where obviously there are requirements for companies, government agencies or publicly owned companies to take reasonable steps to make sure there's no one slavery in a particular supply chain. But I suppose the stick's not really there, or the follow-up is not really there. And I think that, as Mr. Morisano also mentioned, there's a need to, I suppose, operationalize these policies and these procedures in a way that I suppose actions them more clearly and I suppose results in actual outcomes rather than just having a procurement policy there. And I think a centralized approach can enable that.
Okay. Yeah. Mr. Professor Wright, did you?
One of the things that we state in our submission is regarding social procurement clauses and the ways that this could be strengthened, or that the committee could consider strengthening, including around workplace representation. And I mentioned this regarding enforcement because the challenges around enforcement have grown considerably over the past decade or so in Australia, including in the areas that are often contracted out by government, cleaning, security, these types of business services, for example. I would just note that there are, I think effective enforcement is increasingly recognised within the academic research literature as being a multi-pronged approach, that government has a role to play, but so do the trade unions, and so do indeed employers and employer associations. That's something that I think that the committee could consider, the inclusion of representation mechanisms within social procurement to ensure that that workers are effectively represented, and that concerns that they might have regarding whether their labour rights are being enforced, whether the terms of contracts regarding labour issues are being enforced, are then raised through appropriate channels. So that is one way, inclusion of clauses relating to worker representation, that the enforcement issue could be addressed more effectively.
Thank you. I think Mr. Young.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in because actually that was the question I was going to ask you about. I mean, the position of the state historically, certainly for the last couple of decades, has been one of some sort of ambivalence about worker voice, and you're advocating for a much more proactive advocacy of that as a public policy objective. Certainly from my experience, I was involved from a trade union side in the process of privatisation of the corrective services, one of the privatisation of jails, and it was certainly an objective of the employer at the time to use the privatisation or the outsourcing of that service as a way of weakening worker representation, weakening the influence of the union in the workplace, and undermining the kind of conditions of employment. So I just perhaps wanted to ask you to perhaps elaborate on why you think this is actually beneficial to have a shift in, I suppose, from a ambivalent to an overt support for unionisation and worker voice.
Sure. Thanks very much, Mr. Adam, for the question. I think worker representation is important for a range of different reasons, to enable people to have a say in the decisions that affect them at work, as a fundamental principle of ensuring that organisations function in a democratic way, but also because the research evidence suggests that these have social benefits and also economic benefits as well. So there's been extensive research done within Australia, in Europe, North America. Some major reports by the OECD produced within the last few years have drawn attention to the positive impact that worker representation mechanisms can have upon employee satisfaction, upon employee retention. People who are represented are more likely to stay in their jobs longer. This can have positive impacts upon productivity, both directly and indirectly. More satisfied workers are more productive workers. Workers who are more satisfied stay in their organisations longer. That reduces hiring and training costs for organisations as well. For those reasons, among others. These are clauses that should be considered, and they're relevant to procurement because in parts of Europe, in North America, some of the recent changes to procurement policy introduced by the Biden administration that have had consequences for local and state government procurement have also included worker representation mechanisms too. There was a report produced 2 days ago by David Peets, Professor at Griffith University for the Australia Institute and the Centre for Future Work, which drew attention to the benefits that I've outlined in terms of worker representation mechanisms, including highlighting the benefits it can have for workplace health and safety. So the evidence supporting these mechanisms is overwhelmingly supportive, and I think that these are that the committee should take this into account in considering how it can use the powers of the New South Wales government to ensure that procurement produces positive social economic outcomes.
First
Can
of
I,
all,
sorry.
oh, sorry.
Well, could I just add to that really quickly? So I think another thing that's important to note there is there's been a lot to do around supply chains. How do we make sure that there's no labour standards, no compliance in supply chains? And I suppose from the middle of the 1990s onwards, there's been an approach of, I suppose, code of conduct and auditing, which is usually company-led. And recent developments, academic developments and papers have, I suppose, emphasized very strongly that worker representation mechanisms, admittedly both union and non-union, but incorporating worker voice in those, I suppose, code of conduct and auditing processes makes all the difference with regards to enforcement, coming back to that previous question, and making sure that you're not just creating some sort of paper trail, but that there's actual substance where work conditions have been verified by the people on the ground. So whether that's union or non-union, I think that worker force component is absolutely essential in that regard.
Thank you. Professor Boersma, if I could ask you a question, I know that you work in the modern slavery space, and a question posed to the previous witness was, in terms of compliance, couldn't we just beef up the Office of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner? Isn't it the case, forgive me, I'm going to defer to you on this, isn't it the case that the legislation in New South Wales at the moment doesn't allow for a compliance mechanism with regards to that function? So it wouldn't be possible without changing the legislation to give the Commissioner?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure of that, but if I can, I do definitely want to second the opinion expressed by Mr. Nossar in saying that I suppose, capabilities in this area have traditionally lain sort of outside the office, and I recognise that the Office of Commissioner of Cocaine has only fairly recently been established. I think that he is reaching out to many different organisations to, I suppose, form collaborative approaches to the issue, but I don't think that naturally that would sit within his office or a beefing up, I think is a term I heard before. Like, I think that there are other institutions, whether that is New South Wales Industrial Relations, for example, where in cooperation potentially with the union movement and other agencies that have been more active in this space over a long period of time, I think the compliance question would sit there more naturally than with the Office of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner. That said, I think there's definitely a role to play for his office, but I don't think that sort of the central onus of compliance should sit there.
Yeah, in fact, as I know, there is a compliance and inspectorate function within the government already. If I could ask Professor Wright, you've done work looking at, I think you call them, I'm trying to remember, ecosystem comes into it, where you look at skills, industrial relations and location, and how they all need to fit together in order for us to be able to fill skills gap, anticipate skills needs. I wondered if you could speak to that, particularly with regards to the role that government procurement might play in creating the type of ecosystem that does actually allow us to train the workers that we need for the future.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So yeah, skills ecosystem is the term.
Skills ecosystem,
that I've done work on, and building upon the work of others. Yeah, so it's I mean, it's a complex policy objective because, as you alluded to, there's many different policies and many different levels of government that fed into this. And I guess the objective being, how do we ensure that we have mechanisms in place that that allow skills and workforce needs to be addressed efficiently. That's a complex equation because there are you've got training, vocational and higher education, industrial relations, regulations that affect the quality of employment and therefore the attractiveness and therefore the supply of workers going into jobs. Immigration policies as well, increasingly important, always an important part of the ecosystem around skills, but increasingly important in recent years. But regarding what role procurement could play in this, well, in several jurisdictions, procurement plays a very important role. So one notable example.
That's for
Carry on.
us, not for you.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying. Is from Switzerland, as recognised as having a very effective system for vocational education and training. So there was in Switzerland the cantons, which I guess are the equivalent of state governments, have training and apprenticeship targets as part of their social procurement policies. It's one of several criteria that governments can take account of when they're awarding contracts. So there was a study done in 2014 by Miriam Strupler-Leiser and Stefan Walter, looking at procurement policy mechanisms that gave preferential treatment to firms that trained apprentices. The authors found that these policies have a tangible increase on the number of firms who train apprentices and creates incentives for firms to offer training places. And they did this without compromising training quality. So in the Swiss context, the increase was relatively small in terms of the quantity of training being provided, but this needs to be seen in the context of a system that is already very effective, that is much better than Australia's systems, including, I dare say, the New South Wales system of encouraging people to complete apprenticeships. So if a similar mechanism was developed in the Australian or New South Wales context, a well-designed policy, I would suggest, would have the potential to deliver more significant impacts in terms of the quality and the quantity of training increase that will be provided. So that's one perhaps most notable example of how procurement can be used to increase training quantity and while maintaining training quality.
Thank you. I'm going to pass to Ms. Boyd, but do you think you might provide on notice that paper
Sure.
to the committee? Thank you.
Thank you for being here and for your submission. It's fantastic. So the chair has done her usual thing of stealing some of my questions, but I will persist. I just wanted to ask you about, similar to the previous set of witnesses, we sometimes get this negativity around the involvement of unions in procurement and in the system as a whole as being, somehow bad for business and for the economy. Can you talk us through the benefits of unions and whether are unions themselves or the the encouragement of greater unionisation itself a social good? What does the evidence show us?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And when I teach IR, industrial relations at university, have done at UTS and elsewhere. And one of the things I always tell my students is that when you read about unions in the newspapers, the story is always very adversarial. It seems to be in continuous conflict with employers. But the fact of the matter is, and it's much less sexy, I suppose, to report on in the newspapers, is that there have been lots of collaborative approaches there as well. And indeed, the multi-stakeholder model to approach labour standards non-compliance, particularly in industries where we've seen long history of non-compliance. For example, the cleaning industry, which is an industry that I myself am very familiar with. There, the union has come together with the peak body in the cleaning industry, the major cleaning companies, the Fair Work Ombudsman, to try and resolve this issue, which individually they've not been able to, which is basically undercutting and ultimately labour standards non-compliance in various forms. And the realization on the part of unions was, as well as the realization on the part of business was, that the problem in the industry was systemic and neither actor could by themselves fix it. So they came together to try and resolve this, and they have been doing that now for 12 years. Indeed, it's a very vexed issue, so they're making incremental progress towards resolving the issue. But I think that's one example that deviates from, I suppose, the common narrative of unions always being adversarial towards, I suppose, having a very constructive working relationship together with business. So I think that is and that's something that's not emphasized enough in the media landscape, and hence I think commonly a view is adopted that unions are just there to agitate, whereas obviously that's part of what they do sometimes, but the collaboration model has been proven to be very valuable. And just to quickly add to that as well, again, in terms of worker representation and worker voice, they're obviously, I suppose, the originals in doing so. And I think the recognition there as well is that in having worker representation through union voice, we can address these issues, I suppose, in a much more direct way, labour standards, non-compliance, and other social issues. So yeah, I think that the typical characterization of unions is misrepresented there. Yeah.
So if unions are helping with that sort of compliance piece around workplace laws, I would imagine there is evidence that non-compliance is damaging to businesses and to the economy as a whole. So does it then track that having unions in there to help enforce workplace compliance is actually can be beneficial for industries?
Absolutely. And one of the reasons why, and again, coming back to the cleaning industry, one of the reasons why the involvement of the union was actually very much welcomed is because a lot of the cleaning contractors felt that they were competing in a sort of an unfair playing field, because a lot of the other dodgy cleaning contractors, to call it that, were dragging the market down with them. And so there was a desire on part of the companies that wanted to do the good thing, or at least be legally compliant, to sort of say, okay, well, what can we do to stop the dodgy contractors from undercutting the rest of us, because we're obviously missing out on work here. And the involvement of the unions was very helpful there in sort of establishing, I suppose, I'm not going to bore you with the specifics of the cleaning industry, but effectively what they did, again, in that multi-stakeholder framework, is put a bottom in the market in terms of tendering costs. And it indicated that if you would tender below a particular point in time, that it was more likely that you were going to be non-compliant. So either you were overworking people or you were not paying them their entitlements. And again, that could not have been achieved without that sort of multi-stakeholder approach, including the trade union.
I might just add, if I may. I mean, there's no system of effective labour standards enforcement anywhere in the world which doesn't involve unions playing a prominent part. So the countries where enforcement is recognised as being very effective, the Nordic countries, for example, unions are very much front and centre of the system, along with employer associations, in jointly working towards enforcement and to creating a level playing field. The countries where non-enforcement or wage theft and non-compliance with labour standards is a significant problem of public policy, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and increasingly Australia. It's the fragmentation and the decreased effectiveness of these systems has coincided with union decline. So, and as just to restate earlier, it's not just unions who are saying this, it's academic researchers, and it's the OECD, which has changed its view on this. In 1994, it produced its jobs study, which concluded that unions and collective regulation was economically detrimental. In 2006, it revised this to say that certain forms of collective regulation can be positive. In 2019, it completely changed its views from 1994, finding that unions are beneficial socially and economically, including for productivity, and then there's been other studies by economists in the United Kingdom and elsewhere finding that unions have a positive impact upon innovation. So there's a strong business case, and by that, if we look at unions might be bad for certain businesses, but not for the businesses that high-income countries like Australia need to build their economies around, which is high productivity, high innovation business models. The evidence is overwhelming.
Yeah,
and conclusive.
It was a bit of a leading question because I've done my own research on that as well, and I've read a lot of those papers around the drive of innovation and how vital it is to have that sort of union pressure to, particularly in periods of transition of economies, to really sort of build that innovation.
Yeah. There's a paper by academic Wolfgang Streeck, whose term uses the term beneficial constraints, that unions can encourage businesses to do things they might not do of their own accord, but that ultimately lead to higher productivity outcomes. And I think that the characterisation, the negative association with unions is very much a historic one from when the labour market, the industrial relations system and the economy was very different to what it is today. When the pressures upon, when representation was much higher, where unions' behaviour was different to what it is generally characterised today. I think it's not a relevant reference point looking at periods like the 1970s. So much has changed in the labour market that it's essentially an outdated characterisation, not one that reflects current reality.
And the bit about the worker voice and I know we've touched on this already a bit, but I guess the impact of greater worker voice on worker well-being and how that impacts on productivity. Can you talk around that as well?
Yeah, I think, without wanting to completely repeat my answer to Mr. Diadam, basically I think the link is more satisfied employees, typically more productive, but also they have higher retention, which lowers training costs, which lowers staffing costs, and which can positively impact productivity. So I think that's the kind of the causal chain in how kind of the research establishes the positive impacts.
And presumably greater well-being in terms of then reducing the impact on social services, on health systems and everything else as part of that.
Indeed, yeah. So, I mean, there's been studies highlighting the positive impacts that union representation can have on employee health, including well-being. Which would have positive impacts along the lines you suggest.
This was just a chain of questions leading you to the conclusion that unions are a social good. So thank you for indulging me. I think my questions are done though, Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Tudorhope.
Thanks. Aboriginal procurement policy adopted by the New South Wales government is a policy position, of course, which does demonstrate social benefits from the use of procurement, does it not?
Yeah.
And you'd agree that to the extent that you were characterising a circumstance where procurement was used for the purposes of benefiting those employers that provided training or apprenticeships, Aboriginal procurement policy would be another example of how that currently works with the New South Wales government.
Yeah, we've included that in our submission as one example of a procurement connected policy that can result in sort of, I suppose, positive social impact, Jack.
Yeah, and similarly, the small and regional business policies, they are, again, examples of policies which governments can adopt for the purposes of ensuring the delivery of social outcomes.
Sure. Yeah, no, there's a few examples in there, both from New South Wales as well as elsewhere, where we outlined.
So is there a point though where you actually crowd out the space?
Yeah, where to stop? No, that's a fair question. I think that we deal with these issues as they come up. I remember back in 2017 having discussions around modern slavery with corporate governance experts, and I was basically where they were looking at me finally saying, surely that's not an issue that we need to consider. And obviously here we are now, and the New South Wales Modern Slavery Commissioner is about to appear. So I think we shouldn't sort of rule out any particular approach there or any particular social issue in terms of how we can address that. And I think, again, modern slavery was one. If we would have talked about that in the social procurement context, I don't know, 7 years ago, we would have just, everyone would have been a little bit funny, but now we are. And so I don't think it's a question about crowding out the space. I think it's, I suppose, responding to issues that as they arise.
So, but in relation to current New South Wales procurement policy, it requires agencies to take into account the modern slavery as part of the supply chain, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, so Commissioner Cocaine has made some good strides. They've introduced particularly...
He's going to be here shortly. So
he is, no, he will, trust me, he will tell you all about it. Anyways,
So, one of the things that you adopted was a buy local policy, and you were referencing the Tasmanian buy local policy, and it in fact, I think the policy was a benefit of 25% to Tasmanian businesses or Tasmanian economy. Is that correct?
I'll take your word for it. I'm not intimately, intimately. It's in there to, I suppose, demonstrate the fact that something akin is already happening in other jurisdictions. I'm not intimately familiar with the policy itself.
So that you could, in fact, if you wanted to benefit local jobs in New South Wales, you could in fact do a similar thing, but just by increasing the weighting which you give to benefit, which is economic benefits to New South Wales.
That's right, yes.
And that could be just part of a procurement policy?
I would say so, yes.
And governments could do that tomorrow if they wanted to.
Well, governments are doing it not just in Australia, but other jurisdictions as well. In other states it's happening as well. And, you know, there's a risk that if Australia doesn't follow, that New South Wales government doesn't follow, then perhaps New South Wales businesses get left behind.
Well, and in fact, if the government wanted to do this sort of stuff, it doesn't require a great inquiry to do it. It just
Well, it is a great inquiry, yes.
It is.
My apologies.
I'm not sure what the question is.
Well, I'm just saying that the process to go through can be adopting as part of your procurement policy 30% benefit to New South Wales as part of procurement policy. You don't need necessarily to be told to do that. You could, a government committed to do it could just do it. Well, Tasmanian government did it.
Through a process and establishing specific guidelines that are transparent.
Well, there's already a policy in New South Wales, is there not, for 20% weighting in favour of local content?
I'm not actually sure what the line of questioning is, Mr. Tudor.
Well, do you agree with me that the current procurement policy in New South Wales is a 20% component of local content, weighting in favour of local content?
Sure.
Okay, well then, if you had a political determination to increase it to 30%, you could just do it.
Yeah, well, look, I think part of this as well, and this comes back to the previous question that was asked, is, and I suppose this comes back to the key point of your question with regards to whether we need a big inquiry and a long report in whether to I suppose, deal with this. I think what the report has uncovered is a number of shortcomings of the agencies that are ultimately meant to enforce this. And so I don't think it is, I wish it was as easy as waving a wand and doing that tomorrow, but I think that, I suppose the shortcomings that the report has highlighted in approaching this need to be addressed first in order to enable a change in policy, to be honest.
You and I can agree on that.
Good.
Is that to the extent that you have a procurement policy, there does need to be opportunities for ensuring that the policy is being properly administered, and to the extent that there are supply chain issues, you need a mechanism. Now, how do you see that mechanism as being put in place? What's the structure of it?
Well,
What's a proper compliance structure look like?
sure. Well, obviously you've heard a version by Mr. Nossar before. I think that's one approach to take. I think to refer back to something I said before in terms of incremental process, I don't. From my experience in working in industries that have been quite problematic with difficult supply chains, I think it's oftentimes building on what you have. So we shouldn't throw out, for example, I mentioned code of conduct and auditing before. We shouldn't throw that out altogether because it's been a system that has not really been delivering all that much. What we do is see how we can improve that. So if we can improve certification efforts, if we can improve auditing through, for example, worker voice mechanisms to try and get not just a paper trail of someone saying that they're complying with this, that, and the other, but actually people who know whether there's non-compliance or not, and verifying that gives, I suppose, that makes those efforts, I suppose, more robust. So other things, which is something that Commissioner Cockayne will talk about now, are model contract clauses, other, I suppose, co-regulatory initiatives that can unfold. So I wish that I had, I suppose, one distinct approach that I said that would be it, but we've seen, I suppose, all bits and pieces of fine-tuning of the current system, again, whether that is multi-stakeholder approaches, whether that is worker voice mechanisms, whether that is standard contract clauses, which together can help facilitate that incremental process towards improvement, if you will.
So the establishment of a new bureaucracy for measuring or the compliance, is that something you would advocate for?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily establishing a new bureaucracy. As a matter of fact, I think that by centralising procurement, we can actually get rid of a lot of red tape because we are getting rid of a lot of potentially duplicative processes that are happening across the board. I think as well, I mentioned before the level playing field. One of the things that's mentioned in the report, which I read, is with regards to the sort of barriers of entry to small and medium enterprises as well, which I think is something that can be greatly facilitated by centralising procurement oversight. So I don't think we create necessarily a new or larger bureaucracy. I think what we're doing is actually looking at where we can have the most strategic impact in changing our procurement practices, and that's more done through fine-tuning than it is through, I suppose, creating entire new, processes.
I want to just pick up with you to explore the nature of the contract which exists, because generally what happens with a procurement contract is there's a contract between an agency and a supplier. So to the extent that there are enforcement provisions relating to if agencies wanted to in fact embark upon enforcement, they would do so internally through enforcing the terms of an existing contract, which I think you've suggested should have more robust potentially terms in terms of compliance. So rather than set up a new bureaucracy.
Yeah, but that assumes, I suppose, that there is a level of knowledge amongst procurement officers amongst all those agencies, which is not necessarily the case, I believe, especially with new legislation coming out with regards to modern slavery. And again, Commissioner Cockayne will tell you about his efforts to try and reach out to all different government agencies to, I suppose, educate them about their requirements. And obviously, if you would have a more centralized approach, and I'm not arguing that everything necessarily should be centralized, but that we need to find a balance between centralizing and devolving. Clearly, if that would sit centrally, then we would be, I suppose, could be more confident about the expertise required and the capability building required in order to enforce the different types of, I suppose, social dimensions of contracts as well, rather than relying on procurement officers that sit devolved across different agencies who might not have that skill.
You made a passing reference to certification. What's your vision or view of what constitutes certification?
That's a good point. Again, if I can refer back to my experience with the cleaning industry, so what that multi-stakeholder initiative did initially and still does to a degree is certifying individual office buildings to ensure that working conditions for cleaners are acceptable. But that's a very labor-intensive way of doing that. A different approach that they're now taking, again in response to listening to concerns from the market and businesses and cleaning companies is to say, well, actually what we do is we can pre-qualify particular contractors first. So what we do is we engage with the cleaning contractors, we ask them to provide evidence of, I suppose, the way in which they do business, just to frame it like that, and to say, actually, we certify them prior to doing an audit of the building that they work in, so that, I suppose, that streamlines the process. It gives them a tick of approval even before we audit their building. So to say, okay, well, this company doesn't have any major breaches in terms of working conditions for X amount of years. This company doesn't have any major breaches in terms of organizational health and safety in the sort of preceding years.
Do you reduce the pool of potential businesses that then want to engage in the?
No, actually, as a matter of fact, I think what it does, it creates more points of differentiation in terms of competition. I think that, again, speaking to the cleaning industry, all tendering contracts sort of sit at the same level, the minimum amount of profit margin that they can make while still being legally compliant. So there's very little to differentiate these companies. And what we found is if you introduce other, I suppose, potentially social dimensions as points of differentiation as well, but also environmentally, then those might also then become decision points for contractors to engage.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes left to share. I think Mr. Nanda has a question.
Thank you, Chair.
What's the minute?
You'll get one as well.
Just to be clear, in the current procurement assessment processes in New South Wales, you'd agree that there is no framework for public officials to consider direct and indirect social and economic benefits against upfront contract costs when determining value for money propositions.
The current guidelines seem quite vague from my reading of them.
Sorry, what was the answer to that?
Essentially, yes, I agree. The current guidelines appear quite vague in terms of how they treat social procurement targets.
So on that basis, is it fair to say value for money is more often than not interpreted as being based on price and not much else, because price is a clear, finite measure against which to assess a contract?
I think so, yes. That would be my reading of it.
But price is not necessarily value for money?
No. I mean, price is relevant, of course. It's a factor that should be taken into account. But look, it's up to the government about what criteria it sets. But I believe that there should be a great emphasis placed upon training, upon decent work conditions, like decent wages and secure employment. Given that these are challenges that exist within New South Wales and Australia, and these are things that governments can and should use their procurement powers to try to address.
Thank you. Mr. Tudor, you've got another minute 15 if you have any more questions.
Well, in terms of the current procurement policy, do you accept that there are requirements relating to compliance already with work health and safety regimes in terms of the people who are tendering with the New South Wales government?
Yes.
You do? Yeah. So a component which required additional certification that you do, that's already been addressed in the current procurement policy, is it not?
I believe it could go further.
It should go further?
Yes, I think it should, yes.
Yeah.
Beyond work health and safety.
Well, tell me how.
Well, training targets, given that is an issue of poor outcomes in New South Wales regarding
I accept that.
ensuring compliance with industrial instruments. There should be, I believe, clauses stating clearly that that all businesses that gain tender contracts should be compliant with relevant industrial instruments that relate to those areas of.
I think as well, if I can add to that very quickly, I think it's also a discussion about responses versus risk rather than and reward. So I think oftentimes these terms in terms of compliance are seen in the negative, and I think in order to use proper procurement as a lever to improve conditions, we could also frame it in terms of, I suppose, a reward. So rather than having to comply at the risk of not being awarded, you might also be rewarded by demonstrating that you are, I suppose, better than your competitors. And again, this comes back to that point of differentiation that I mentioned.
But you do that by loadings, wouldn't you, or weightings?
So you may answer this one, and then we are out of time.
Oh, sorry. Yes, that's one way that you can do that. Yes.
Thank you both very much for appearing today and for your submission. I think you have taken a couple of things on notice, and if there are supplementary questions, they will also be provided to you by the Secretariat, and you'll have 21 days to respond. Thank you again for appearing.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members.